Merkley here, and we're starting a half-hour Twitter Spaces discussion with some very extraordinary individuals who are experts on immigration issues related to children. And before I have them introduce themselves, I wanted to share a little bit about why I think this issue is so important. If we turn the clock back 4 years under the Trump administration, there was a speech given by then Attorney General Sessions in which he called it his zero tolerance policy. And as I was reading that speech back then in 2018, I said to my team, it sounds like what he's saying is he is going to deliberately injure children, ripping them out of their parents' arms in order to discourage people from immigrating. And I thought, this is not America. In America, no one deliberately harms children for any reason. And my team said to me, well, there's one way to find out, and that's to go down to the border and see for yourself. And so that following weekend, I went down to the border at the McAllen-Reynosa border crossing and went to the detention center. And there I saw, as the first member of Congress, to witness children who had been ripped out of their parents' arms and put. I was absolutely stunned. And when the nation learned about it in the subsequent day and days following, the nation was stunned. On that same day, I went up the road to Brownsville, where I heard that there was a former Walmart where hundreds of boys, a large percent of who had been ripped out of their parents' arms, were warehoused. I was told that there might be some 1,400 boys, or more than 1,000, that were, I think that more than 1,000 is what I was told. And I thought, that's impossible. Impossible that hundreds of boys have been warehoused in this former Walmart. I went up, I knocked on the door. The manager refused to talk to me and proceeded to call the police to have me taken off the property. And what I learned was that indeed almost 1,500 boys, a large percent who had been ripped out of their parents' arms, were warehoused in this facility, just adding to the horror. The fact that I made that trip, within a week, the press gained access and the whole nation knew what was going on. Never again can we allow something like this to happen, in which children who become the victims of our government deliberately harming them. And so a group of us have put together the Children's Safe Welcome Act. I'm pleased as a sponsor to have a dozen co-sponsors who many of whom have worked hard on this issue, but I particularly above and beyond to help forge this moment going forward, to get this Children's Safe Welcome Act introduced and to push for it to be considered by the Senate. So that's the background. And today we have with us several experts who I'll now ask to introduce themselves. First of all, Neha Desai, Senior Director of Immigration at the National Center for Youth Law. Can you mention a little bit about your background, Neha?
Sure. Thank you so much, Senator Merkley. I'm really honored to be here. So, as you mentioned, my name is Neha Desai. I am the Senior Director of Immigration at the National Center for Youth Law. I'm also counsel on Flores, a class action lawsuit governing the custody, detention, and release of all children in federal immigration custody. The first time I actually met with a child detained in immigration custody was over 20 years ago when I was volunteering as an interpreter before I even went to law school. The child had been trafficked from India and he was alone in a facility in Chicago. He was absolutely terrified. And Honestly, I've been forever impacted by the many, many hours I spent with him in that facility. And since then, I've had the privilege of spending the entirety of my career representing children in government custody, including children in state child welfare custody, state juvenile justice custody, and children in federal immigration custody. And truthfully, I continue to be inspired on a daily basis by the youth that I represent. So thanks again for having me here today.
And you were so helpful when I was immersed in this 4 years ago, and helpful to members of Congress throughout the years that have followed. Second panelist is Mary Miller Flowers, Senior Policy Analyst for Child Protection at the Young Center. Mary, could you share a little bit?
Thank you, Senator Merkley. And I echo Neha's appreciation for all of the work you have done in support of children and for this opportunity to talk about this important bill. Again, my name is Mary Miller Flowers at the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights. The Young Center is as independent child advocate for unaccompanied and separated children who find themselves in federal custody. And what these child advocates do is they serve sort of in the role of guardian ad litem, advocating for the best interests of these children in every decision made about them, from their apprehension, their custody, their release, and their immigration case. I'm on the federal policy team, and I really am impressed by the huge strides that the Children's Safe Welcome Act makes towards the goal of treating children like children, regardless of their immigration status. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mary. And our third panelist is Melissa Adamson, attorney, immigration and legal advocacy at the National Center for Youth Law. Could you share a little bit about your journey in this area?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for all of your work on this issue. So my name is Melissa Adamson, and I'm an attorney at the National Center for Youth Law. My work also focuses on immigrant children, mainly federal litigation and policy advocacy on behalf of unaccompanied children in immigration custody. And along with my colleague Neha Desai, I serve as Flores counsel, which means that I have the privilege of meeting with children in immigration custody across the country to hear their stories and working to ensure that their rights are enforced. And over the past several years, I've spoken with probably hundreds of immigrant children in government custody, and I've really seen firsthand how the current system operates to harm instead of help children. And so it's because of that I'm very excited to be here today to talk about the Children's Safe Welcome Act and how it gives our country an opportunity to really protect these children's safety and well-being. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Melissa, and let's dive into the conversation. And the first question I wanted to pose, and I'll ask Neha if she could respond first. Can you speak to how the immigration process currently treats children at the border, for us to understand why a bill is needed?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Senator Merkley. So it's important to remember that the immigration system was never set up with children in mind. It was set up to detain adult men. And when Nickel and co-counsel Flores back in 1985, children arriving alone were subjected to body cavity searches. They had to share sleeping quarters with adult strangers, had absolutely no educational or recreational activities, and they were detained indefinitely in facilities that were inherently inappropriate for children. So thankfully, we have come a long way since 1985, but there is still a really long road ahead of us to get to a place where we have a system that meaningfully meets the needs of kids, which first and foremost means prioritizing children being with their families and out of government custody. So I'm going to briefly explain the current process that children arriving on their own go through, and my colleague Mary will explain to you all the process that children arriving with family go through. So unaccompanied children are children that are under the age of 18 arriving at the border without their parents' guardian and without legal status. And the first step in their journey is that they're picked up initially by Border Patrol agents, or they present at a port of entry, at which point they're detained in Customs and Border Protection Facilities, CBP. So when people think about kids in cages, they're thinking about these facilities. These are the images that you've all seen of children in fenced areas with silver mylar blankets on top of them. And thankfully, the cages themselves are not currently being used for children anymore, but the fundamental set of these facilities is the same. They continue to be inherently inappropriate for children. So generally, children are only supposed to be in CBP custody for a maximum of 72 hours. But over the years, there have been multiple stretches of time in which there was severe overcrowding in CBP, and children were in custody for days or even ends. And I will tell you, having spoken to a number of kids that have experienced this prolonged detention in CBP, the trauma that they experience from that is palpable and lasting. Once a child has been determined to be an unaccompanied child, they're supposed to be transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR, which is an agency within services. The Office of Refugee Resettlement runs a network that currently has over 200 facilities in 22 different states. So once they're out of CBP custody and in ORR custody, hosted licensed facilities, meaning facilities that are licensed by state child welfare authorities. But as of last month, about 30% of children in ORR custody were actually in unlicensed facilities. Once they are in ORR custody, the last and most important part of the process is that they're supposed to be released to sponsors. So typically unaccompanied children have family members here in the United States that are ready, willing, and able to take them, to bring them into their homes and care for them. There are children that arrive without anyone able to sponsor them, and those children are in a much more difficult situation, end up spending far longer times in custody. There are two programs, the long-term foster care and unaccompanied refugee minors program, that are supposed to serve children without sponsors, but many children wait months and months, if not years, for these placements. So I'm going to pause there and turn to my colleague Mary to talk to you about the process for children that are arriving with their families.
Thanks, Neha, for that important information. I wanted to talk to you briefly about children who arrive with parents or legal guardians. And kids who arrive with parents or legal guardians are treated in a different way than kids who are unaccompanied. Children who arrive with parents are called accompanied children, and the family is treated as a family unit. So the children will face the same conditions of care and the same legal process as their parents. They will go to CBP custody, which Neha has already mentioned can be very traumatizing for children. The conditions are often freezing cold. There's inadequate food. There's little medical care, probably rarely pediatric care. And in the past, children have actually died in CBP custody for lack of proper care. And so it's not a great place to be. Family units right now are often not able to make their immigration case because the Title 42 order that remains in place at the border. So children apprehended with their parent or legal guardian are often expelled back to their home country without a chance to seek protection. If they do get through 42, they can be subjected to expedited removal, which could take a few hours just to determine whether the family merits an immigration process to seek protection. If they make it to court, children and their parents must appear before an immigration judge with no right to counsel and face the government attorney who will be prepared to argue against them. So it is not a system designed with children's special needs and capabilities in mind. There is another group of children that is a little bit tricky to understand, but there's another group of children who are children arriving with family members who are not their parent or legal guardian. So children arriving with grandmas, aunties, uncles, or adult big sisters or brothers. These children are evaluated by Customs and Border Patrol, who will then determine them to be unaccompanied children as well. If they don't arrive with a parent or legal guardian, they are an unaccompanied child, and they will follow the same process that Neha outlined. They'll be sent to the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. It's current practice to immediately separate these children from their grandmother, auntie, or uncle, or big sister. And that is without any analysis as to whether that's a safe and trusted family relationship. And so one of the things that we're really excited about with this bill, and we'll tell you more about soon, is ways that we can try and keep those children with their trusted family members, with the people they love, and not cause additional trauma to these kids.
Say, Mary, I'm going to ask you a little bit of a follow-up before we proceed, because you mentioned Title 42, and I want our listeners to understand what that is. And my brief version, and correct me if I have this wrong, is that Title 42 says that the administration can declare a health emergency, and that health emergency basically allows us to say the border is closed, and therefore people have to stay on the far side of the border. I think it's sometimes referred to as remain in Mexico, though you might be able to clarify whether that's slightly different. Essentially, under the Refugee Convention, which says that if somebody knocks on our door and asks for protection, a safe harbor, we have a responsibility to provide that safe harbor while we evaluate the refugee status. But under Title 42, that doesn't happen. We don't get to that stage. Have I kind of summed it up more or less correctly?
You've done a great job summing it up. That's very much what is happening right now. Title 42 remains in place at the border, which, as you've said, is related to it's an antiquated provision about a public health order. We've had many experts in public health come out and say that this order does nothing to reduce the coronavirus or any other serve any other public health ends, and yet it remains in place, and it is clearly a violation of our responsibilities under the Refugee Protection Act. It is clearly a way to shut down opportunities for people to seek their legal right to asylum. And so we argue that Title 42 needs to be rolled back. And one thing that maybe people don't know is that unaccompanied children are exempt from Title 42, which is a good thing. We do want unaccompanied children to be able to access protection. But think about the scenario where you're a mom or dad arriving with a child, or you're an auntie or grandma, and you realize as an adult you can't get protected, but if you send the child across alone, they might find protection. And so we're seeing a lot of family separation because of Title 42. And it's a consequence that I'm not sure many people know about.
And it is certainly the case that one does not win asylum automatically. One has to demonstrate their case, win their case, if you will, and that's a difficult challenge. But that's a bit of a conversation for another day, because we are focused right now on how children are treated immediately. And so I'm going to ask Mary if you can continue, and then we'll turn to Melissa to talk about how does this proposed Children's Safe Welcome Act, which I'm so pleased to sponsor and have many co-sponsors for, how does it act to change how children are treated in our immigration system?
Thank Very much. And just to echo your point, Senator, when children are separated from their families, whether it's under Title 42 or when grandma is taken into custody and child is sent to ORR custody, children often don't have the information they need to make their asylum claim. So you have, in many ways, weakened chances to make those claims for protection because adults hold a lot of that information. And now the child is separated from their trusted adults. One really exciting provision of this bill is a process put in place where the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which has custody of unaccompanied children, would be detailed to designated reception locations at the border in order to meet those children arriving with non-parent family members. So meet the child arriving with grandma or big brother or auntie and have a look at that family relationship. There's many instances in which it is clear that grandma is a safe grown-up. Grandma knows where she's going. She's got an address of a family member in the United States. She understands or can be provided with the information about her legal process. And there's no reason for this child to be separated from that safe grown-up and put in federal custody. Not only is it traumatizing for children to be separated from a trusted loved one, it's also to detain people, and it's an inefficient way of using our resources. And so the bill offers an opportunity to really elevate what we know is true in our child welfare best practice, that if children cannot be with parents, the next best place for them to be is with their kin, is with their loving family unit. And so the value of family unity is really front and center in this bill in important ways. And I will turn it over to my colleague Melissa to say more about the protections offered when children do find themselves in federal custody.
Thanks, Mary. So as Mary just noted, this bill first prioritizes keeping families together. However, many children arrive at the border without family members. They travel completely alone to the United States to seek safety. And so for those children, temporarily cared for while the government identifies a sponsor to whom they can be released, this bill aims to minimize the time they spend in immigration custody. And this is tremendously important because we know that children with longer lengths of detention experience more stress, anxiety, and depression than those who are detained for shorter periods of time. The bill increases protections for unaccompanied children throughout the immigration process. And today I'll just highlight a few of the biggest changes that it would make to our current system. So first, the bill updates the system to reflect what child development experts have actually known for a very long time, that the safest place for a child is in a family-like setting and not in a large-scale congregate care facility. As we speak today, as of this very minute, thousands of immigrant children are being held in large-scale facilities that house hundreds and hundreds of children at the same time. And now, while these facilities might cover a child's basic needs like food, water, a place to sleep, research has shown that these types of institutional environments are actually profoundly harmful to children's short and long-term health outcomes. So what this bill does is it requires the government to phase out the use of these large-scale facilities and then shift funding and prioritize placing children in family-like settings, which are significantly better for children's well-being and safety. The bill also strictly limits the use of unlicensed influx or emergency facilities and requires that children are held in state-licensed facilities. So, for context, over the past few years, the government has frequently used unlicensed facilities, known as influx or emergency intake sites, to house unaccompanied children. And people listening might remember hearing about these sites on the news. Some were located in massive tents on military bases, others were at convention centers or halls. And unlike typical shelters, these facilities did not have state licenses to care for children. And this is extremely concerning because state licensing is critical to protecting children's well-being, for two main reasons. First, it means that facilities are subject to independent oversight. And second, it means that facilities have to follow comprehensive child welfare standards, which cover everything from medical care to staff training, education services, and so on. And as my colleague Neha mentioned, as of last month, approximately 1/3 of all unaccompanied children in government custody were still being held in unlicensed influx sites. So this bill codifies into federal law that at baseline, all unaccompanied children in government custody are held in state licensed facilities and in family like settings. And the bill also requires that the government may only use unlicensed facilities as a last resort in the case of emergency. And even in those situations, the bill places strict limits on the ages of children that might be transferred to those places. It sets detailed, excuse me, and comprehensive standards that really mimic what's required by state licensing. And it prohibits the placement of any child in an unlicensed facility for more than 20 days. So those are huge changes that will have immense improvements for unaccompanied children. I'll highlight two more areas, and the first is this bill heightens protections for children with disabilities. This is especially important because immigrant children with disabilities in government custody are at particular risk of being segregated in more restrictive facilities and detained for longer periods of time than children without disabilities. So currently, immigrant children in government custody can be stepped up or transferred to more restrictive placements due to behavior that's related to their disability. This can lead to them being kept in government custody instead of being released to sponsors that are ready and willing to care for them. And we know that the longer children spend in custody, the more harm is done to their mental and physical health. So this bill aims to address these problems in a couple of different ways. First, it prioritizes the swift release of children with disabilities to their sponsors so that these children can get out of government custody. And then for children with disabilities in custody, it requires that they're placed in the least restrictive environment. It places common sense limits on the government's ability to transfer them to more restrictive facilities. And it requires that children with disabilities have access to the necessary medical care, services, and accommodations while they're in government custody. And the final change that I'll just highlight today is legal representation for kids, having a lawyer. So this bill guarantees legal representation for unaccompanied children at every stage of their immigration proceedings. And this is a really critical change because right now, more than half of unaccompanied children don't have legal representation. And research shows that legal representation is essential to ensuring that kids can actually access the immigration relief that they qualify for, which makes sense because it's virtually impossible for children to navigate the immigration court system by themselves. So in guaranteeing legal representation for unaccompanied children, this bill will do two main things. First, it will protect children's legal rights and promote their safety and well-being, and then it will really improve the efficiency of the immigration system as a whole. I'll stop there today, but I just want to note that the bill makes many other changes that will improve the well-being of children. And I know that Senator Merkley's office has put together some great summary materials that highlight all of those changes. And I'll pass it back to the senator.
Well, thank you so much, Melissa and Neha and Mary, for being huge champions for children and for really noting that the way we treat children at the border has a lifetime impact on the success of these children, and whether they succeed in their asylum case and stay in the United States, or if they fail to succeed and are returned home. We do not want children to be injured and traumatized. It's our responsibility, and I'm sure many listeners are going, aren't all these things automatic? And I mean, minimum health and safety standards and state licensed facilities and legal representation of a child before a judge and keeping families. And the answer is no. And that's why we need this bill. we need to make sure that we treat every child at the border, whether they come as part of a family unit or come on their own, as we would want our child treated in that situation. Make sure that they have the foundation for success in the future, and certainly never, ever deliberately injure children as a strategy for discouraging people from seeking asylum. So thank you. I really appreciate our experts and all of you for listening. And I hope we can give some real momentum to this basic codification in law of standards for treating children at the border. Thank you and all my best.